This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Permanish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Life Worlds and our final one of the year before the Christmas break. I just want to say that I have been so humbled and energized and grateful to receive all of the thought-provoking questions that you sent in for our special Q&A episode, which is coming soon. I'm going to be working on it while on holiday. And just the diversity of inquiries, geographies, and orientations was astounding. I'm really consistently humbled by those of you who reach out to me with your stories and reflections. And thank you. It keeps us all going. And for those of you who might still have a lingering question on your lips, you've been wanting to ask about the topics we cover on the show, it might not be too late. So send me a message through our lifeworld.earth website, linked below in the show notes. Now, on to today's episode. We are going to talk about imagination. You know the imagination? That spontaneous, lyrical, expansive characteristic of humans that we seem all too often to delegate to our children and the young ones, or perhaps to distant, wistful moments of daydreaming out a window. What does imagination have to do with life worlds, you may ask? Well, it goes beyond our ability to imagine what it might be like to be a bat or a lemur or a watershed with rivers coursing down our spine. Imagination is our ability to conjure, to dream up entirely different worlds, and to make them feel so real that we can even begin to live into them and shape their forms into our embodied reality. Imagination is what births narratives, social stories, and civilizational constructs. It is the genesis of our shared collective agreements around things like money. Hey, let's all agree that this piece of paper is worth 20 units that I can trade for real food, or help us to build rockets that bring us to stellar orbs. Imagination is myth, creativity, art, play, innovation. And today we will be exploring where the rubber hits the road, where imagination and intentional design meet. We will be speaking with Anab Jain, who founded the UK-based design and experiential futures company called Superflux, along with her partner John Arden in 2009. They quite literally bring imagination into concrete physical reality, building new worlds in the shape of scenarios, films, live experiments, situational interventions, stories, prototypes, superfictions, and public art pieces. Their mission is to help people imagine through lived embodied experiences how different futures could look and feel, especially focusing on the complex and deeply interconnected nature of today's global challenges. They say that by creating concrete experiences in the future, we want to transform decisions today. Or said differently, Superflux builds future worlds that you can inhabit in the present moment. Everything from relating to how climate change has rippled across an urban landscape, to issues concerning AI and algorithmic autonomy, drones, the future of remote healthcare, and, as we hone in today for Life Worlds, fundamental questions on our relationship with the more than human world. So imagine this, and this is a real piece they made called Refuge for Resurgence. You walk up to an installation, and here you see a table of 14 stools, plates, and ceremonial cutlery. In front of this table setting, you see a fox, rat, wasp, pigeon, cow, human adults and child, wild boar, snake, beaver, wolf, raven, and mushroom. This mythical banquet was commissioned as part of the Venice Biennale of Architecture, and it reimagines a meeting between different species in a hypothetical future after the current era of human domination. Superflux say that this opens up the psychic space to ask, what if? What if? And allows people to experience, test out, and embody alternatives to the present. The banquet didn't ask onlookers to think of the logistics of a dinner party with a snake, although that actually sounds pretty interesting. Instead, they wanted people to reopen their imaginations and wonder what world might emerge if we saw ourselves as an intimate part of a wider ecological whole. Perhaps you've also been walking around London recently, and you might have come across another mythical frieze, a continuous narrative wrapped around the building of Bush House on the Strand, offering a view into transformed worlds, both familiar and strange. Think pagan folklore and animist societies. This work they made was not based on idealistic fiction. Anab Jain went and spoke to many King's University professors and researchers from all around the world, discussing everything from neuroscience to war studies, geography, finance, and policy, to create these mise en scène where human culture and nature are no longer separated, and indeed collaboratively thrive, recognizing their latent power to change the systems. The protagonist listens to the groans of the earth, they write. Public spaces were reclaimed. Car parks became ecological sanctuaries. Sparkling, dew-heavy mosses and lichens bloomed upon the crumbling concrete and repurposed monuments. The Thames was cradled by verdant riparian zones, alive with the lyrical orchestra of crickets and dragonflies, bees and beavers. Time felt different, and there was more of it. More time to be generous and to rest. Finally, a re-enchanting of what had always been, the human spirit rewilded. End quote. It's worth mentioning that Superflux received the Design Studio of the Year award in 2021 for their pioneering practice of critical foresight. Their roster of clients and themes is as fascinating as it is diverse, from working with the government of the UAE to create a range of immersive experiences around renewable energy futures, to the IKEA Group in creating a large-scale immersive installation for New York Climate Week called Action Speak Summits. This was a 2-story sensorial exhibition space that highlighted action from over 30 companies looking at the climate impacts of how we eat, move, make, grow, and power. They've even built a fictional fintech company to provoke business leaders into considering plausible futures for the asset management industry, and developed visions for the future of rail transport that led to new policies for the UK government. And on the show today, Anab gives us a glimpse of a future project that really piqued my interest: how to use mythic context to move society past the fickle problems of multipolar traps. In a way, I think we are all designers in our own right, of our lived environments, our homes, our relationships, our minds, the language we choose, and the concepts we choose to spend time on. Design and imagination is everywhere. It is part of being human, as deeply ingrained in us as thousands of years of genetic memories of making stone tools. And my invitation with this episode is for us to really consider the implications of what Anab shares. This notion of speculative futures and embodied intelligence, of how to include our bodies and therefore imaginations as a critical part of decision-making, including and transcending just the facts and data, especially important when it comes to wicked issues like social and ecological breakdown. I will share more in my concluding remarks, and so for now, here is Anab Jain from Superflux. Good morning, Anab, and welcome to Life Worlds.
Morning, Alexa. It's lovely to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I think we're both in our wintry sweaters and wintry days in our respective lands, so season's greetings as well. Anab, you have written that Superflux creates cautionary tales, superfictions, future archaeologies, and immersive simulations. I love that term, by the way, future archaeologies. It's such a fun play on words. So for those of us who aren't well-versed in design lingo, such as myself, can you start off perhaps just by contextualizing these kinds of experiences and what the difference is between maybe quote unquote normal design and speculative design, or the design that you're focusing on? Is the focus of a speculative designer different to other designers?
Thanks for pulling out some of the most interesting aspects of our work. At Superflux, we are exploring the space between knowing and doing. So there is the weight of present day incentives sort of creates fear in people's minds about stepping into the unknown. And so, what speculative design, or you might call it sort of critical designs, design fiction, these various terms are a form of practice and actually a philosophical approach that, in a way, helps people imagine what else could be. And we do that work of imagination through storytelling, through creating artifacts from possible futures, through taking people physically into different physical future worlds to imagine and experience directly what a future might feel like. And there's a lot of background research and foresight work and horizon scanning and looking at trends and weak signals and all of that. But what we've found is that that sort of space between now and then cannot be just understood through data and trends and weak signals. We realize that there is a sort of systems homeostasis, if you like, that stops people from stepping into that world. And that's where the work that we do can be really powerful, is that it's about weaving new narratives that connect our present to the future. It's about showing a glimpse of what could be, because we are biologically wired and we are perhaps better able to understand the possibilities if we directly somehow experience them.
So here's a bit of a weird question, maybe, but as I was reading through all of this, and we're going to dig into everything you just said, is this aspect of speculative design and sort of inhabiting realms of possibilities through our physical lived experience, is that something quite new, or have humans done this in the past? And when I say past, I mean 2,000 years ago. Like, is this a modern quote unquote invention, or when have humans done this before?
No, absolutely. I think humans have done that. Imagination, imagination. The work of imagination is as old as we are. And what we imagine is, in a sense, what we are and who we become. So, it was imagination that led people to start to understand that if I have fire, I could do this with it. So there is such a strong correlation between imagination and invention and innovation, and it's kind of what has driven society. We have hope for the future in the midst of all the crises. There is a reason to believe that something better could happen. And that is the work of futuring. It's like, what else could it be? How can we navigate these crises? And that's what we've done. But what happened perhaps around post-Enlightenment period with Descartes and with the kind of early 18th century rise in use of data and graphs to make economic quantification easier to understand, we started to lean into that way of thinking and started to sort of foreground data sets and quantified entities as the way as a mechanism of decision making. So everything that fell into a graph and formed a sort of a curve gave us a sense of what could be. But everything that fell off the curve, the anomalies, were not considered. So I think actually we might I might be it. I could almost say that we've forgotten what we used to do really well.
That's so interestingly said, and I love that imagination and invention and innovation are all very related. I've understood through reading your work that a big focus of your thesis is this need to inhabit the different realities to incite real change. And you've said, connecting our bodies with knowledge, which is what you've sort of just alluded to as well. Stating the obvious, but actually, I want to go a level deeper. Why is it that connecting our bodies with the knowledge is so important?
Ian McGilchrist has written a really interesting book called The Master and His Emissary, and he kind of goes into the depth of the differences. There are a lot of similarities between the two parts of our brain, but there are also some significant differences. And he talks about the right brain and its ability to connect us to the world. And I kind of want to lean into that thinking a little bit. And also the work of many, many philosophers who talk about being in the world. We make sense as humans by being in the world, as in an embodied way. The Gabor Mate has written about how the body keeps remembers trauma. So there is so much evidence now, scientific, linguistic, philosophical, about the the importance of how we learn to read the world in an embodied way, and that is embodied intelligence. And I think that ability to draw and infer possibilities based on how we experience the world is deeply, deeply rooted in what it means to be human today. So we have sort of, if you talk about George Lakoff, the linguist, he talks about how the human brain only uses about 2% to understand data. And yet, we are leaning so heavily on only data to make decisions instead of embodied intelligence. So I think I want to really emphasize that it is super important to learn, relearn, to relearn to make our body an important part of our decision making process.
Something I have found so inspiring about your work is this focus that you're doing of bringing this embodied participatory intelligence, the right brain, if you will, to the world of climate, biodiversity, all of these really, really emotionally and just very emotionally challenging situations. You might already be answering this through some of your pieces, and again later we'll get into individual pieces, and I kind of want to unpick them, or processes, or maybe calling them a piece isn't the right word. Obviously, I'm not a designer, so I'm probably not respecting exactly how things should be called. But if there was something that you could gift to many people around the world, and I think culturally it's hard to say everyone, but maybe you could pick a wide audience. If there was some physical experience, embodied experience you could give them that has to do with our relationship to the natural world, right? That they could experience through the wisdom of their bodies, that would fundamentally change our relationship, what do you think it would be?
That's such a difficult.
No, it's really hard. That's why you can segment, because it would be different, I'm sure, for someone in
Yeah,
Chile than in. But still, I think it would be
yeah.
interesting.
Definitely, it's such a. It's. I mean, it's a challenging, but such a good question, and I have to say, I will lean back on my recent experience of visiting Bhutan, as I keep going on about recently. But if I could take people on a walk, on a journey through a mountain and a river and a valley in Bhutan, then I think that would bring home the point that nothing else can. The sort of intimate and almost unspoken relationship between ecology, as in not just nature, but everything that we are connected with. Your body, your heartbeat, your breath, the river, the flow of the river, the prayer wheels moving past because of the streams of water, the flags, the sort of chants of the monks in a distance, the beautiful hum of someone preparing a meal, the sort of poetry of birds in an orchestra. All of that sort of has no division. It just flows between one to the next to the other. So it's like now I'm working Now I'm going to stop working and go for a walk. And I'm going to go for a walk in nature and I will look at some trees. There isn't those boundaries on there. And what that does is it makes us really care. You know, fundamentally it's the work of caring for not just nature, quote unquote, but our ecology, which we are all a part of. So I think that's what I'd do if I could.
Yeah, in another life, Anab, I don't think we spoke about this, but I was guiding learning journeys in Mexico, and I was bringing investors and CEOs deep into the land to impart a first-person experience of deep ecology, or this real felt sense, of being the whole, and this caring, as you say, and caring as a form of practice, I think is, and also it links a bit back to what you said in the beginning about fear of the unknown, and the abstraction of nature can lead to a lot of fear. We don't want to camp. We're scared it's going to be dark and cold and there are bugs. And then, how can we care for the wilds if we feel so awkward in them in a way? I think we'll always feel a bit awkward, and there's a healthy amount of respect that one should have. But still, we'll get to Bhutan after, because I also just came back, and I was thinking a lot about this constant movement of prayer through landscape. There is a word that you've used, I can't remember if it was on your website or one of your pieces, around high fidelity futures. And I want to pair this with the more than human realities that you're starting to move into. So this phrase, high fidelity futures, if I understand it right, you sort of scan the horizon like a radio telescope. You scan for signals and then you detect them, and then you're like, okay, which ones can we amplify? And at the same time, you're sort of looking at these ground level realities, and you combine the two in these future mappings. It's like, what are the whispers, and then what's the ground truth? And so in terms of this scanning the horizon for signals, I've been noticing that many of your recent pieces have to do with not just sort of climate breakdown or alterations in the climate, but I would call it breakdown personally, but also these more than human realities. And so I'm curious, was there some kind of shift that happened to you in your terms of your relationship with nature? And or is this a signal that you picked up that you feel is growing and that you're now amplifying in your work?
Yeah, no, it happened because of a project we were doing. So my partner, John, with whom we co-founded Superflux, was already thinking about climate crisis. And, he was creating projects like post-crash civilization. How do we invest in a post-crash civilization? Way back in 2005 and 2006. And then once we set up practice, maybe around 2014 or so, we started doing work to understand how to make climate crisis tangible. So we found that there was so much talk about it, but it was always in the form of graphs and data. And again, as I was talking earlier, it felt very difficult, we found, for people to put themselves at any point in that graph and understand what it means for them, unless you are living in one of those vulnerable communities who've unfortunately already faced the tragedy of climate crisis. So we started a project called Mitigation of Shock, which went on for about 5-6 years. And that project, we started out by asking a very simple question. In the face of crisis, in the face of economic instabilities, in the face of systems breakdown, what food will we eat? Simply, fundamentally, because we found that food and food insecurity is something most people can relate to. We gather around food. Food matters to us. So we started, my colleagues John and others in the studio started to build food computers from scratch, from abandoned, discarded waste materials, contraptions that would grow food indoors really quickly, using lots of experimental methods. And that's high fidelity, just to kind of lean into the idea that I very much respect futuring work that requires you to think about ideas and signals and prepare reports or put post-it notes on the wall about ideas. But that is, you can put words on a paper, but how do you actually then make it into something that people can truly experience? And that process of translating something that as a weak signal or an idea into an actual tangible thing is the fidelity of translation. And that fidelity is important because depending on the fidelity, people might understand it as a sketch or a gimmick or a render or something credible that they believe they can suspend disbelief and enter. So that's what we did. We created a home in London around 2050 or so, which was transformed because of the ingenuity of a local community to start growing food in ways that they could support themselves and their friends and families in a failed state scenario, in an extreme climate crisis scenario. Whilst we were doing that and creating the work of high fidelity, a one possible feature in high fidelity, we had to grow all these things in our studio. Our studio became like a indoor farm. I was carrying these kind of ultrasonic boxes of mushrooms here. Will they grow here? Will they? And it's as they started growing, as we started to observe these roots, beautiful, intricate root ecology suspended in in nutrient fog, because we didn't need water or soil to grow them. Um, Something started to happen from being designers who are, usually the end product is something that goes on a shelf or is shipped to a client. Here we're dealing with things that grow, live, and die. It became really clear that we're not foresters and we're not farmers and we're not tree surgeons, but we started developing this very intimate relationship with nature. And I think that's when I started thinking a lot about the more than human aspect, that I am actually a carer and a translator and a facilitator of the ecologies that I'm very much a part of. And that's when in 2019 I wrote the kind of From Human to More Than Human manifesto in the creation of a very high fidelity future.
I love that it was the act of like growing and the physical roots that gave you that perspective. And the fungi are always, I mean, they're, mycelium is like one of the most probably overused metaphors by now, but still that
Yeah.
they connected you. Did you give some of these plants like did they become like household like friends or pets? Did some of them get like names, or was it hard to hand them over to this exhibit? Were you sort of attached to some and you're like, this guy, I want to keep him at home, to your partner? You're like, this one isn't going into the exhibit.
Absolutely. It became, we took, it was in Barcelona, and we took our home there. So we took our old sofa, we took our son who was 4, his toys, his drawings, our old clothes. We really set up home there inside this apartment. And actually, the reason we made this apartment is because we have a child, and we started thinking very seriously about what would be the world that he will live in. What does that look and feel like? And so, in a way, we were creating his future home. And I think just having that sort of deep emotional connection with a home that we wanted him to inhabit and feel like there were resources and methods to confront our worst fears and find a way to navigate some of our crises was really important. And I think it's that sort of, it might sound cheesy, but it's that love that you bring to a possible future because you are deeply invested in it, because it's not just an intellectual exercise that you're putting out in order to meet some of the demands of an industry. You're doing it because you want people to actually consider it even if they hate it. We had a book that said pets as protein. Like, people hated it. You don't want to eat your pet, but confronting people with these provocations is really important.
Yeah, I think it goes back again to this act of caring. Like I think there's a lot of debates about like humans naming things. I had Tyson Yunkaporta on the podcast, and I think it was at some point end of last year. And he was saying, in a way, we don't want to name things because naming is this like Cartesian Linnaean kind of act. But I also know people who have like given names to their houseplants, and it sort of like brings them into being part of the family. And so it's not just a passive houseplant. And obviously there's a lot of work being done now on like plant sentience or plant consciousness and how much are they picking up. I think also, speaking of like this signal thing, I don't know if it's just because I'm operating in this world, but I'm really curious if you're also seeing the amount of people who are starting to talk about what would it be, sort of animism, ecocentric consciousness, more than human views. I know you guys have done this a little bit, like bringing more than human perspectives into citizen assemblies, so into sort of communal
Mm.
democratic processes. Do you feel like that's still something like super fringe on the edges, or are you seeing it kind of disseminating more through the cultures that you're inhabiting, whether it's your own physical communities like neighborhoods or your design community? But what can you tell us about that signal and what you're sort of noticing as a pattern?
No, definitely. I think within the design and art world and the cultural worlds, this has been an idea that I have seen get embraced in the past few years. A lot of people are thinking about multi-species worlds, about how do we uh, consider the perspectives of more than human companions? How do we sort of acknowledge the rights, quote unquote, legal rights of more than human entities? There is a lot of work in the cultural and art sector. I'm not so sure about the more business side of things. There are, of course, the outliers like Patagonia saying the Earth is our biggest stakeholder and so on. I think it's definitely there's definitely a change and a shift in how people are seeing the world. I wonder whether COVID had a role to play, but yeah, definitely.
And then I think as a designer, in terms of this active translation, you guys have written, we must view ourselves as not separate but deeply entangled. We need to foreground her part of a larger ecology and not a master of our surroundings. And I heard in one of your talks, you worked with your students in giving rights to a glacier in Austria, and you got involved in some of these citizen assemblies. So what's the process like, not just necessarily within your own practice, but when you start to work with others, of what works well and what doesn't in terms of having people design and connect with the more than human world? Because also I think there's this element of we can design with the more than human or with the nature as like an equal participant and ally, or we can design for and sort of on or about. And I think those things are very different. And so I'm just curious with some of the experiments and works that you've done, like what works, what doesn't, and what's it like to start to be like, all right, let's work with the salmon or let's represent the salmon or whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's also such a good question because I think there can be a danger of it becoming a trend. And like now, I'll do it, this is cool. But I think it's deeply complex. So there's a really interesting, beautiful German word called Umwelt, which is how do you understand the perspective? What does the feeling of the other species of the entity, the not more than human entity, what do they feel? And what is their sort of perspective on the world? And some of my students tried really hard to understand that for some species and struggled, and rightly so, because and there are two camps. There are people who say we shouldn't give legal rights to natural entities for good reasons, and those who say we should. So I think fundamentally it will come down to what's at stake. If I grew up in India, and the Ganga and the Yamuna are the big rivers that are, they hold deep spiritual importance for people, and we will all have a little brass pot of Ganga water in our fridge as this kind of, it always stays there. When someone passes, you've got to take it out and put a few drops on their forehead, and it holds deep meaning. And yet, and they've been given they are legal entities now. But yet, if you see the way they are polluted and mishandled, and it breaks my heart to see how is this possible that you are dumping all your waste in the very river that you then bathe in and consider to be deeply sacred. So I think somewhere something is lost, and I am not sure whether these works are fully acknowledging the deeper fissures that have taken place over, I think, a few hundred years. The work is deeper, I think, and that's why I come back to Bhutan, where it's the spiritual infrastructure is in place for this work to happen. So I feel right now we have to keep doing these kinds of works. It's really important, but we also have to create the sort of the ground, the groundwork for these ideas to land and be held and be considered as part of everyday life.
Yeah, there's so much in what you responded. I was just in Nepal doing a sort of a Buddhist pilgrimage around one of the sacred mountains there, around Manaslu. And it struck me so much similarly, these deeply polluted rivers that are, held to be so sacred. And even in Bhutan, where I went to after, there's still little plastic trash wrappers that are in the fields, and they do go into the rivers, even though the rivers there are obviously much, 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 much cleaner. Or inside some of the temples, there's, everyone's making offerings, but those offerings are like single-use packaging. And so there's some sort of deeper rupture, as you say. And we've been thinking a lot about, like, what is it like to embody? So Umwelt, life world, is how I've translated it. And obviously it's the title of the podcast, because we think a lot in the podcast about how we embody those perspectives. But then who are the individuals such as yourselves who are learning and being bridges in those acts of translation? So we do think there's a role, for example, in the rights of nature work, when you have the guardian that's representing that living entity, they have to be the ones doing the act of translation. So they have to start asking, okay, what would the river want? Or what would this bee want? Or what would this, mountain want? There's something about, I know there's also different camps around anthropomorphizing, but there's something about, we have come so far from even understanding that some of these other entities have a life world, that even just placing ourselves in that life world is meaningful. Where I align with what you're saying is, if this is a one-off, I think a one-off can be deeply transformational for some individuals, but maybe not many. And I'm very curious about your pieces, like people interact with them once, or maybe they're walking through London and they see one of the provocations you've put on the walls of the Strand. We'll get to those as well. But if it's a one-off, it's not part of infrastructure, as you said, or spiritual infrastructure. And what really struck me in both Nepal and Bhutan was it's constant reminders throughout the day. I'll read a little passage after about something I wrote while I was there, but as you said, it's the wheels around the water, it's the prayer wheels, it's the malas, it's everywhere, and it's prevalent. And so how do these one-off instances of imaginary or imaginings become constantly throughout the day or throughout the weeks in such a way that it actually starts to shift us?
That's the infrastructure that we need. That's the support we need. That's the support that cultural work needs. Because I think cultural work is climate action. Fundamentally, this work is climate action. If these stories, if these pieces, if these artworks are enabling us to go and think about things differently, look at the work differently, start to care for our ecologies in a different way, then that's deeper work. That's the work of climate action, because when you care for something, you'll want to act on it. And I think that's the fundamental difference, is that you can tell people as much as you want. We know all the facts are there, the data is there, and yet it's not enabling the kind of action at the scale and with the urgency that we need. And why is that? Because I don't think there is a gap in knowledge or gap in intellect. I think there is a gap in caring. I think there's a gap in imagination of how different the world could look if we cared. We always assume anything that is not like the now, like the present, is likely to be difficult and dangerous. And we don't want to go there. And we don't even want to imagine it. So all the climate work we're doing is being done to maintain this way of living. Let's use products that are zero carbon. But continue to use products. I think that's what I think, that these are all interconnected issues. I think what one-off pieces start to do is start to seed the work of imagination. but the infrastructure to make sure there's more of them, there's continuously lots of them, these counter narratives. Um, that work is the work of investors. That's the work of business leaders. That's the work of the political stewards of our world, if I say so. Yeah.
It's super tricky when you think about counter narratives because, in a way, we're in this weird postmodern era, right? And in a way, we need a blossoming of such a multiplicity of narratives.
Yeah.
And some of them contradict each other. So I work more in the nature and biodiversity space. There
Yeah.
are real trade-offs between decarbonized net zero worlds and highly, nature-rich worlds. Whether it's how mining happens or whether it's transitions in cities. So what I like about what you've done is this marriage of some of the science and the data and the imagination. So I'm going to highlight now one of the pieces that you did, this Earth Commission, the Safe and Just Earth System Boundaries. So it was September of this year, and I thought it was so cool. I didn't realize that you guys had done a piece around this until I was on your website. But 60 scientists from the Earth Commission published a report that was called A Just World and a Safe Planet, and they spoke of principles of justice in these new boundaries for the global commons. And then your studio designed a digital visual chronicle, so digital and visual, that narrates a possible evolution towards this future. And I was looking at it, and you have like urban spaces and deserts and farmland and lots of different sort of context. And there was this lens of interspecies justice, intergenerational and intragenerational. So what I'm curious about there is, how did you address the emotional journey of the people who would have interacted with that? Like, how do you help them to process, there's grief, there's awe, there's hope, there's wonder, there's all of these potentials as they interact with a visual art piece? And back to this question around a one-off, how did you design an arc, or how could one, where that real emotional felt experience of the science? So you looked at the science. The Earth Commission is highly technical in terms of their team and their work. Then you translate into something visual and artistic. So there's data and graphs in that implicitly, but visually portrayed. So how do you bring people on a journey, and how can it not be a one-off?
The work that Earth Commission do is really powerful, and the Safe and Just Boundaries work is especially so because for the first time, safety and justice are at the center of scientific work, and that we need to talk about interspecies justice and intergenerational justice, which is deeply powerful. There is data, there's graphs, all of that is in the Lancet paper already. So what we wanted to do was to be able to tell people who are coming to it for the first time the story of what that would mean. We intentionally do not want to try and communicate everything in a visual chronicle, because they can read the paper to find out the facts, and it's available. What is really important is how do you take people on a journey through a space where you know that things are going to get worse before they get better? And how do you help people navigate that journey, hold multiple possibilities in their mind, and not retreat from the ache and discomfort of those possibilities? In order to do that, we have to take them through the journey where they know that if these things are acted upon, there's hope. And there is hope. And I think fundamentally, even though I've spent 15 years of my life thinking about futures and the second, third, fourth order consequences of things, I still live with a sense of hope, because if I didn't, I couldn't really function. So, and I think that's important, that and again, I think there are many camps, like, you've just said, there are multiple different perspectives and viewpoints. A lot of people think we are doomed and it's going to be terrible. And I do believe that the way we are going right now, it's going to get worse, but there is hope, and there are many reasons for hope. And that's the visual sort of North Star that we want people to move towards, that, there's all these actions that we can collectively take, the leaders can collectively take for us to get there. And that was really the driving force of this work, how do we help people navigate? So they might come across really difficult moments and pollution and smog and what have you, but there's hope.
How do you not over idealize or oversimplify what that, and also what's the right timeline? And I know that you've been asked this before, but I'm curious how you're thinking about it now. What's the right timeline of the post things get kind of worse, they get better, and then how do you not make it sort of like a, techno agrarian, like
Yeah.
it's something that's just I don't know, I can't even imagine that.
Yeah, I will qualify my hope with the word that hope is not utopia. We very much not trying to say this is a utopian future or this is a dystopian future, because every possible future is in between those two spaces. And so I really lean heavily on Ursula Le Guin's ideas of hope and imagination. Her utopian story was Those Who Walk Away from the Omelas, where everybody in the town was happy because of this poor child who was imprisoned in the basement. So what I mean by hope is the hope that gives us the energy to be able to navigate the crisis today. That it's active hope, that the hope comes from our actions in navigating these crises. And that's what I'm trying to sort of hint at. It's not a fixed moment in time, as much as beacons of hope that kind of we might encounter as we keep moving along. And the reason I think it's going to get worse before it gets better is because I still hear from a lot of people that let's keep it under 1.5. And I'm in large gatherings and in important meetings, and I'm really shocked because we know that we are already past that stage. And so there is a deep cognitive dissonance that is actually going to stop us from acting, because this desire to not address ambiguity, this desire to averse risk, the desire to keep the system in the state it currently is overriding any other way direct desire to move forward. So yeah, that's
And that plays into what you said in the beginning around fear of the unknown. I mean, this term that you used, active hope, it reminds me a lot of Joanna Macy's work. And she has this
absolutely.
spiral, and in the spiral, we have to face the facts or face the realities as they are and move through the grief and the despair before we can move into a form of hope or action, let's say, that has a sort of congruence and integrity to it. So it's not false optimism, which will always eventually be shut down and then kind of leads to also very strange solution sets that aren't, again, rooted in realities. And so, and it's interesting you mentioned active hope there, because as I'm sure you know, in Joanna Macy's work, you have things like the Council of All Beings. And
Mhm.
I think that the role of anthropomorphizing and putting ourselves in the shoes or the hoofs or the fins of the other it's playful and it's joyful and it's weird, but it brings communities together and you're kind of doing this strange thing. But that is also, it's less about like, did I really represent the interests of the badger well? But it's more, well, for people who don't know what badgers are, I don't know the hummingbird well.
Mm.
And did I come together with a group of people to bond on this topic, to have a moment of play, to have a moment of sort of surrender and joy and silliness and meaning and possibly grief? Like, that is also part of the world building and making. And sometimes the output of life worlding is less important than the process of creating the active hope.
Yes, I completely agree. We will never truly know what the hummingbird wants or needs or is thinking. But what we can do is try and explore the adjacent spaces to that, see the spaces that they need, encounter the other species that they are engaging with, understand the need for the river to flow in this uneven way so that some of the other species can come and drink that. So that level of deeply interconnected ecological systemic thinking is what I'm trying to get at. Is when you try and understand how the hummingbird operates in the world, you start to understand how our entire ecosystem operates. In a way, it's a bit like Darwin's "In the beak of the finch he saw entire evolution," and it really sort of plays on that.
It's funny, by the way, when you mentioned interconnection, I'm going to say something very strange, but it was so striking. When you spoke about Ursula Le Guin's Those Who Walked Away from Omelas, I just remembered that last night, I literally, I've read that book a while. It was the main story of my dream. And I was with a group of people, and we were thinking about whether we should walk away from Omelas. And I had forgotten about my dream until this moment. And then you mentioned this book, and it's just bizarre. Like, anyway, that's just
Oh, wow.
disconcerting and
That
strange. And
is.
yes, I think, but also we don't know how things function, and we know that time can be non-linear in so many ways, and that there are many aspects of consciousness that are just beginning to be known. And so, you mentioned this, I had this strange dream, and anyway, it's just funny. But not going too much into the pseudoscience. When you speak about these imaginings, let's say, of the other creatures, one of the pieces that you did that I wish I'd experienced is a refuge for resurgence. And it's this, very famous mythical banquet that you put together. I've described it in the introduction of the episode that I spoke earlier. And it's a sort of meeting between different species in a hypothetical future. So why did you choose a dinner table, by the way? And what did you hear about how this sort of, interspecies banquet buffet, how did it change people's perspectives and imaginations?
So that work is actually continuation of our project Mitigation of Shock, which is a home. And so if you think about it, this was also a deconstructed home of sorts. That's what we were thinking. And food was the centerpiece of the work of Mitigation of Shock. How do we as humans grow food and learn to live in a food insecurity? Building on that, we move from speculative realism in that work to mythopoetic fabulation in the refuge for resurgence. So we are starting to say, we understand in a speculative reality, this might happen, this feels familiar as a home. But we also find sometimes one of the most powerful ways of catalyzing imagination is through myth and through fantasy and through storytelling in ways that are familiar yet deeply disconcerting and unfamiliar even. So our a multi-species table was the idea was we like to gather around food as communities. Well, let's gather around food as Earth's community. And what is, whom should we give a seat at the table? Well, we wanted to give those we consider pests and vermin intentionally a space at the table, because we've decided to make snakes or sort of foxes and pigeons pests. We consider them pests because we've come and occupied these urban spaces which they used to occupy, and they've multiplied and become more vicious. But that was not how it was. So our multi-species banquet is a festive celebration of 14 different species. Well, there are two adults and a human child, and there's a wolf and a wild boar and a snake and a mushroom and a rat. They all are given plate settings. So we have a story on the illustrations of the plate that my colleague Nicola beautifully illustrated. And you go from present day and the fox all the way down back to the gathering of people and species together in the last plate. And that is the story of resurgence. And that is the story of ecological resurgence. We also created cutlery, which my colleague Leanne designed beautifully from foraged materials using jewelry making techniques. And the oak tree that was used to create the table was a gift from someone who were moving out, and it was a dead oak tree. So we have a dead oak tree that creates refuge and has a second life in a way to give refuge to all the species. So it was entirely handcrafted during the 1 year of COVID lockdown by me and my entire colleagues in different parts of the country. And it's one of my most favorite works because I really feel that if we metaphorically, not really, uh, philosophically and spiritually, can give other species a seat at the table, we would change how we think about our ecological world.
What did people write to you or communicate to you afterwards about how it changed their perspectives? I'm curious about, it's hard for me to find online how it moved people. I'd be very curious what you saw and what you guys heard from it.
No, we receive a lot of emails from people and messages on social media. Um, there were some people who thought this was a feature. This was a possible feature, and were quite upset that we put a small child next to a wolf on a dining table. Fair. And then there were many people who felt very moved, who thought it was very poignant, who took lots of pictures, who sent other people to go and see it. It's a traveling work. It's traveling for a few more years. Um, I think works like these, the intention of these works is for people to sit with them, and we do not expect people will immediately come back and say this is amazing, but rather to consider and let it sort of percolate in your mind. What does it mean to really start looking at those we considered pests and vermin differently? What does it mean to to be more compassionate and caring? What would it mean to not extract from our earth for the food we want, but actually share the food we want with those who we share the earth with? So I think I'm hoping that it's something that sort of lives on with people, really.
I think a lot about like the kinds of festivals or gatherings that we can start to create or recreate. And I wonder what like you know how some people do like death over dinner or whatever it may be, or these like climate cafes where people gather and talk about, which is a really cool model, by the way. Yeah, how would it be to integrate these interspecies banquet elements into dinners or meals or processes where people are already consciously gathering for a slightly different cause? And could you guys like write like a little manual for like, if you want to speculatively integrate a wolf or a rat at your table, here's some advice, and then just sort of how it starts to disseminate so that people are like, oh, like there's this thing where you can also like create a banquet for other species and bring it into their homes.
That would be amazing. Yes, we should really do that. We've really thought of it as an artwork so far because it was
Yeah.
so much work to craft it. So, but what the Barbican did was really lovely. They created an ecological curriculum for primary school children. So we did a workshop with them where the school children created their own banquet, multi-species banquet, where they brought one other species they'd want to dine with, and it was just beautiful. It was really moving. There was a willow tree, and there was a squid, and there was just beautiful. And then they created cutlery for them to dine with, and offerings for them. So it's really, and at that age, when you're 7, 8, 9, there wasn't even a question of like, why on earth would you ask me to bring a different species to die? It was all free flowing. Of course, yes, I brought my squid, and I brought my some squidgy microorganism or something, a snail. It was wonderful, really.
It's an amazing thing that you could bring to schools, actually, come to think of it. Is
Yeah.
like, and as you say, like, we are so naturally imaginative, and then it kind of gets like, pushed out of us. But intrinsically, we are so,
Yeah.
I did this thing once in this Christmas fair in Bolinas, where I used to live in North California, and we had this little stand called Gifts of Nature, and we were embodying the perspectives of different beings, and we were handing out these beautiful cards. And this little girl came up to us and she was like, you know, when I walk in the forest, the river speaks to me and there's river dragons. And her mother was like, yeah, yeah, whatever. And I was like, no, you keep that alive. I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, you keep that perspective alive. If you were to move out from how these apartments may look or these meals may look, and back to this idea of like spiritual infrastructure that you referenced in terms of Bhutan and other places you've been to, and obviously growing up in India, and this, it's like a rewilding of our imaginations for one of your other pieces, but it's also like a re-spiritualizing, and these things are very
Mm.
connected. How would you imagine physical space and topologies being different in order to trigger and inspire us, right, to see the world through these perspectives? So if you could redesign maybe some aspects of like a modern city, how could they look or feel different, or what could you place inside of them to generate that shift?
Yeah. This is actually the work we started doing, which is a public art work called the Quiet Enchanting at Somerset House in the public space. It's still on show. Um, it it is John and I often talk about the idea of what does rewilding mean, and there is this idea of rewilding in our cities and the safe and just earth system boundaries. One of the big things is creating nature corridors and bringing back more biodiversity in our cities. And some of these rewilding projects are really, really inspiring. However, sometimes it feels a bit like let's landscape our cities, and that's when I think we need to rewild our spirit and we need to rewild our souls before we can rewild the world around us. So what does it mean to rewild ourselves? I think it means that we start to see the world and our place in it differently. It starts to mean that we pay attention to the hummingbird and the ecosystem it needs to thrive, and consider the various other species that are then connected to that ecosystem, and then start thinking, what does it mean? What are the sacrifices we need to make in order for those ecosystems to start thriving differently? And I think that it'll have to be radically different. I think we have to live radically differently. I think doing few wildfire meadows is not going to cut it. So my dream would be that we start to really reimagine our cities and our urban spaces and our sort of concrete pedestrian zones with little bits of flower pots here and there. Um, to how do we need to live, how much land do we need, what is the kind of ecosystems that need to thrive, how do we need to work differently, and so on. It's a big complex undertaking, but that would be my sort of dream of how we live and how we change our surroundings.
So if I'm walking through Mumbai or London or Paris or Rio de Janeiro, well, Rio is already quite different, but Sao Paulo, and Superflux had this like crazy magic wand, you would have different structures in place. You could maybe have, anything. How would that animist, interspecies, intergenerational, what would be some things you would see that would be so radical that it's not a pollinator pathway necessarily, which is super important, but what are some of the flashes that come to you when you think about that in terms of how these places are really quite radically different?
So yeah, absolutely. I love wildflower flower gardens and meadows. Don't get me wrong. What I mean is at the scale at which we are talking. Um, so in India, we have these architecture for animals and species. So there's in Gujarat, we have where I'm from. You have this thing called chabudro, which is basically a sort of totem, but it's a pigeon house. So you have these beautiful, and they're going away, they're disappearing, but they're beautifully, intricately carved, but they're little little homes for pigeons to rest in, actually, and they're quite big, and they used to be dotted everywhere. We used to have big banyan trees, and under banyan trees you'll have these circular sort of seating areas where people would sit and hang around. The cows are already freely roaming, and everyone's feeding them as much as they want and whenever they want. And there's a big issue of monkeys, urban monkeys. But the point is that inbuilt is architecture for other species. When you're building and planning the city, you're also planning for ways in which the other species can live and thrive in and around the city. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we create big long corridors, which I think would be amazing. Actually, that is a project in mind, to have this wildlife corridor that runs across the city and motorways and everything. But the other thing is architecturally, we are inspired by biomimicry. Why don't we continue to be inspired by biomimicry to design and allocate public space, allocate building regulations to that design, quote unquote, architecture for other species, not little bug hotels, which is lovely, and playgrounds, super cute, but at scale. I don't think it's going to happen because it's crazy, but if I had a magic wand.
I think it can happen. I know enough, neighborhoods in certain parts of the world. I don't know enough about mega cities like Nairobi or, Beijing, where I haven't been to it about 10 years. So I don't know what
Yeah.
the cultural fabric is like there. But in Latin America, where I've spent a lot of time, and in Northern
Mm.
Europe and America, I can completely imagine, as you say, it's these whispers or these signals where if one or two communities build that, or
Mhm.
someone on the podcast spoke once about the Memorial Day for Lost Species, and
Yes.
these different communities started to host these memorial days, and maybe instead of a day, it's a statue, an effigy in the place you live, or
Hmm.
something I've been thinking about, or like earth temples, and
Mm.
an earth temple could be as small and humble as it could be, as church and large and church like, or whatever it may be, as possible. But I think if we don't start to change our physical built environment, even if it's 10 places in the world initially, those are, again, the little seeds and whispers that you're like, well,
Absolutely.
someone in Brasilia did it, so I could do it here in some simple
Absolutely.
way. And I think that's the role of designers, because I wouldn't know, I was a political scientist by academic training, and I wouldn't even know where to begin designing something like that. So I think we need designers to help create small prototypes so we can then understand how we can do them ourselves.
Hmm. Absolutely. No, I agree.
Yeah. So this is a quote. Maybe it's, instead of like a prefab house, it's like, what's a prefab? The pigeons. A lot of people in London are probably like, pigeons. They make homes
Yeah.
for these
Yeah.
creatures.
Yeah.
But you did something also wonderful around this invocation for hope in Vienna, right? And people worked
Hmm.
through these perfect grid of burnt trees, and then they reached
Hmm.
this thriving forest, and there seemed to be a pool in the middle where they gazed, and saw other animals thriving.
Hmm.
And so, again, in terms of these spaces, you had people move through the death and the breakdown before the regeneration.
Yeah.
How do you think that looks like in terms of how people might design things in their homes or cities to also make space for that piece? Or
Mm.
is it just happening by itself? And so we're seeing the breakdown regardless. So we should focus on creating the regenerative pieces.
Exactly. The idea was that quite often you see the breakdown, but it's really hard to see the resurgence afterwards. And I think that was the idea, that it was, bringing the trees, the skeletal remains of the trees of a wildfire that happened just an hour away, to the museum, and to get people to confront that grief was important. But it was also important that um, they can regrow, and we can help this regrowth and this resurgence. And if you're going to do it again, let's do it differently. What does a multi-species regenerative forest look like? What does it mean to take a moment to contemplate on that and not see our own egos in the reflections, but to start to see the other animals looking back at you, to have this moment of quiet connection. Um, yeah, I think the encounter with with hope and possibility is as important as the encounter with grief. Anna Singh says something really well. She says that it's important to tell terrible stories beautifully. And the story of wildfire is a terrible story of monoculture farming, extraction, violence, and so it is important that we tell that story and reckon with it in order to come to the center of the space and hold on to that moment of reflection that other worlds are possible.
Oh, absolutely. I'm quite curious, and maybe I can start wrapping with one or two final questions because of our time. What's one immersion, story, experience, speculative, future archaeology, going back to the terms from the beginning, that you have been, or you and your studio obviously, have been wanting to design or create that's been particularly challenging, or where you guys have said, you know what, maybe this translation isn't even possible?
There are a few things, there are quite a few things, to be honest. We are wrangling with some really complex ideas at the moment. One is in the space of spiritual ecology, sacred ecology. Very much interested in continuing that side of work in a deeper sense. And it's hard.
Can you
And
say
the other side.
more about that quickly? What do you mean by spiritual ecology and all of
I
that?
really want this walk through Bhutan, or this idea of this interconnected ecological sort of reckoning, and spiritual, not in a religious way, but spiritual as in an interconnected ecological way, to be experienced in an immersion. That would be a dream, and I am just working on a narrative idea at the moment to explore how and what form that could take. Um, and the other side of thing is something that I've talked a little bit about in a recent talk called Rewilding Our Imagination, around multipolar traps. And we find at a bigger level some of these things, like, we talked about having multiple or multiple perspectives, and how do you hold on to the pluralism without falling quickly into one camp or the other camp. And that's the work. What a multipolar trap does. And so we are really interested in wrangling deeper with that particular idea, and again leaning on the mythic, and the sort of mythopoetic, to talk about confronting the egregore, or confronting that sort of trap, in order to have that other perspective. It's really difficult. Um, I don't think it's necessarily as difficult as in ambitious is the right word. So we have an idea for something that's deeply ambitious. So we just have to figure out how to go about doing it. But fundamentally, we are interested in addressing the meta level concepts that may help us to collectively see some of the things we are wrangling with, some of the tensions we are wrangling with, from a slightly meta level perspective.
That's super interesting. So, from my understanding of multipolar traps, they have us believe that there are win-lose game dynamics, right? If you win, I lose,
Yes.
etc. And they don't lead towards I'm using game theory language, but trying not to be too jargony here, but they don't bring us towards like a win-win world. So maybe you could speak, maybe this is probably our last question also in terms of time, or we'll wrap, but What would be a multipolar trap? You don't have to pick the one that's still in work, so you don't have to
Yeah,
disclose too much. But
yeah.
maybe they can think of another one. What would be an example for our listeners that haven't come across this phrase before of a multipolar trap? And then I love that you would use the mythic to sort of reconcile, or to, would it then help us see, hey, we can all find a place where we don't all lose, and obviously compromises have to be made, but without falling again into idealism. Yeah, just make that part come alive for us, because it's super interesting. I'd never thought about using mythic story around a multipolar trap.
The multipolar trap is, yeah, where individuals or entities act in their self-interest, leading to a collective outcome which means everyone ends up worse off. So some of the very popular climate related ones are things like, climate agreements. We see that in COP all the time. Nations wait, hoping that someone will act on it, and then nobody does. Like, who's going to put their hand up and say, yes, carbon tax, we will start levying carbon tax. Every nation seeks economic growth fueled by carbon heavy industries. Short term gains are clear, accelerated warning that harms us. Like, basically, it's so easy to fall into those traps, and we do that all the time. Our feeling is that we need a different lens to look at it fundamentally, and we need a different lens to acknowledge this. You see that in the form of egregore in Twitter or things like this, where it is basically how ideas are spreading, and how something we saw even Twitter anymore, but whatever it is, social media, where something spreads, and then everyone starts believing that something, and then that idea starts to have a life of its own. And it is, in a way, a myth. It is a myth in a way. So what we're exploring is, what does it mean to be able to make decisions today that collectively move us towards a better place, if we are constantly going to be spiraling within these entities that have started taking lives of their own. And that's something that is, I don't know yet exactly what that will be, but it's early days.
That's very interesting. One thing, we spoke for some of our research with our foundation. We spoke to this group. They're called Monastic Academy. They're up in Vermont, and they are working with, let's say, computer scientists and designers who are working on artificial intelligence. And part of what they're trying to do is shift the consciousness. It's also sort of very grounded in Zen Buddhism. And they're trying to shift the consciousness of the humans that are building some of the technologies within those systems to create a different sort of version of an AI entity that would counteract these, maybe it's similar to the concept of egregores, that would sort of counteract the way that AI is currently being built. But I do think that, especially technology, these beings, whether it's singularity or it's it's ChatGPT, but they do take on a very mythic lens, and so it's interesting to hear you speaking about it in that way. Well, I am very excited to see how a multipolar trap can be born into the mythic lens. So wow, I really appreciate the depth of like intellectual and scientific rigor that you bring to your work, combined with such like poetry and nuance around the embodied. I think it's really, really rare. So Anab, it was such a pleasure to have you on, and always so much more to keep talking about.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
This is Life Worlds.